So our first speaker is Shira Cohen, who is a postgraduate student at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, and previously was the research assistant at the Institute for the Study of Intelligence Methodology, and also the Israeli National Cyber Directorate. She is a committee member of Israel Young Pugwash, and her talk will be on cyber arms race from war zone to agreements. So Shira.
Thank you for having me. Just share my screen. Great. So, hey everyone, as presented, my name is Shira Cohen. I'm representing Israel SYP, and today I'll present my paper, Cyber Arm Race from War Zone to Agreements. So there are different opinions as to whether or not we can compare the nuclear arm race in the Cold War to today's cyber arm race. One of the main arguments being the degree of destruction and threat of nuclear weapons versus cyber weapons. To address this, I want to quickly share a few examples of the damage that the cyber arm race can lead to. So in 2016, hackers took control of a US treatment plant for drinking water and changed the chemical mixture. If the changes had gone unnoticed, this could have led to the poisoning of tens of thousands of people. Also in 2017, a cyber attack of computer systems in hospitals was reported in about 100 countries, and the main damage was on UK hospitals, where many treatments were cancelled and much of the activity was disabled, risking the lives of many. One last example, last month in a city in Florida, hackers managed to take control over the remote system of a facility that supplies water to the residents and try to poison the water. So while the results of a cyber attack are not as graphic as the results of a nuclear bomb, it can be just as deadly. In addition, cyber attacks can have serious economic consequences and lead to total chaos. Thus, I've chosen to focus on cyber as the new domain of arm race. So far, the cyberspace has led to extensive new research in recent years. Many of these studies usually analyze cybersecurity issues and focus on specific cyber attacks. In my paper, I will suggest a different approach to the issue of offensive cyber capabilities. And also, there is no consensus regarding the definition of the offensive use of cyber capabilities, and therefore we'll refer to the term as an act that is perpetrated by states or non-state actors who make use of cyber weapons, not including the use of artificial intelligence weapons, with the intended purpose to cause serious damage to infrastructure. So the cyber arm race, which includes an increase in offensive cyber capabilities, presents significant risks to global stability. Therefore, I argue that it's necessary to regulate, or at the very least delay, the global competition. So the main argument of my paper is that, as demonstrated by the nuclear arm race during the Cold War, international agreements may be the way to delay and even reduce the impacts of an offensive cyber capabilities arm race. To support this claim, I will compare the nuclear arm race with today's cyber warfare. In this paper, I define, as you can see, 6 different stages that occurred during the Cold War: the initial conflict, mutual deterrence, expanding the conflict framework, detente, extending deterrence, and agreements. I suggest that these stages are implemented in the current cyber arm race, while taking into account, of course, the differences between the two domains. So let's take a look at each stage. The first stage, the initial conflict, refers to one major event or an accumulation of events that led to the start of the arm race. In the nuclear age, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, in 1945, can be marked as the beginning of the arm race. Within the cyber realm, this stage is characterized by several important events rather than a single event. In 2007, attack on Estonia government websites, which paralyzed the banking and communication system, the cyber attack on Georgia in 2008, the 2009 cyber attack attributed to North Korea carried out on US and South Korea institutional and civilian websites, and the 2009 attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. All these events together started the cyber arm race. In the second stage, mutual deterrence, the players in the competition seek to acquire capabilities that could deter the other from attacking. The difference in deterrence between the nuclear and cyber realm is based on different tools that the actor uses to establish deterrence. Nuclear deterrence uses uses offensive tools, while cyber deterrence typically uses defensive tools. So as we know, during the Cold War, the US tried to prevent the USSR from acquiring nuclear capabilities, but in 1949, they also created their first nuclear bomb. In cyberspace, countries today seek to obtain a deterrence based on strong defense, meaning deterrence by denial. This kind of deterrence would force the attacks to accept that any attack would exhaust resources and eventually fail. The US, as you can see, the UK, France, and Germany have published national cyber strategies based on defense tools development. The third stage, expanding the conflict framework, it characterized as an escalation and de-escalation cycle when the actor increasing their capabilities and attentions. In the nuclear arms on the left, the beginning of the escalation cycle can be seen in the early 50s when the US and USSR developed hydrogen bombs. A few months later, in order to prevent escalation, US President Eisenhower proposed the Atoms for Peace proposal. Despite the attempts to reduce the tension and de-escalation, the players continued the escalation, as we can all know, which peaks in October 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the cyber arm race, the third stage can be seen on two levels on the right. The first level, countries establish new cyberspace defense agencies, meaning the actors acquire capabilities that increase tensions and encourage the players to continue the arm race. On the second level, the actors increase the amount of cyber attacks carried out. For example, between 2014 and 15, 7 significant cyber attacks were committed. Along with the escalation, calls for de-escalation have risen. For instance, in 2010, the Washington Post reported that 15 nations agreed to start working together to reduce cyber warfare threat, including the US, Russia, and China. So the rising tensions forces the players to accept that they share a common interest and must work together, and thereby moving on the fourth stage, the detente. This stage is characterized by an attempt to build trust in the relationship. In the Cold War, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and USSR managed to limit their competition through some of the earliest agreements on nuclear arms control, including the PTBT, Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. And in the cyber realm, the concept of detente has been applied in a US-Russia relation as well as US-China relations. So in 2009, the Obama administration talked with Russia on cyberspace militarization and established a joint agreement. And in 2012, the US and China publicly agreed to open talks to decrease the tension on military aspects of cybersecurity. Now the fifth stage, extended deterrence, which means that the deterrence is not threatening to attack the territory of the direct enemy, but threatening to strategically attack a place that matters to the enemy. I will explain. During the Cold War, extended deterrence was used to deter the USSR from attacking Europe. And the US did so by developing capabilities and collaborating with Western European countries. In cyberspace, extended deterrence is used the same way, but the different parties include more players, which makes the arm race more complex. Therefore, in cyberspace, players choose to collaborate with actors that share similar agendas or interests. For instance, member countries of both the EU and NATO have separately signed similar agreements for cooperation. At the same time, Russia and China are promoting a regional cyber treaty. The last stage of the arm race is agreements. As I mentioned, in the nuclear era, during the detente period in the 1960s, some of the earliest agreements were signed. These agreements acted as important precedents for the turning point in 1968, the NPT, the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. This treaty has led to the signing of more agreements, such as SALT I, START I and II, START, and New START. All these agreements have been key factors in slowing down and reducing the nuclear arm race. For reference, as you can see in the graph, The number of nuclear warheads in the 1980s was approximately 64,000, while as of 2017, the number has been reduced to about 9,000. In the case of the cyber arms race, the final stage of agreement has not been achieved. This is my main point. As demonstrated in the Cold War, international agreements may delay and even reduce the potentially deadly effects of an arms race. Therefore, it is necessary to create and implement an international treaty within the cyber domain. This treaty will create the basis for further agreements in the field and slow down the next generation arms race that is currently taking place in the cyber realm. So despite the need to reach this agreement stage in the cyber realm, the efforts made to do so have not been successful. Currently, there are no agreed international rules or norms to control an international conflict in cyberspace. There are several reasons that make it difficult to form an international treaty, including the anonymity of cyberspace operation, the speed and rapid development of the domain, and the fact that states have different opinions. Despite the difficulties, it is necessary to find solutions. So to form an effective outline of such a treaty, a few main principles must be considered. First, this type of treaty should include the establishment of international mechanism of supervision, verification, and testing. Second, in terms of enforcement capabilities, although it is difficult to conclusively attribute a cyber attack, absolute proof is not necessarily needed. This is because if the attack was carried out from the territory of a specific country, the state can be held responsible as a governor that did not stop the attack. Another principle is the need to create a mechanism of dialogue between the various cyber players, both at the leadership level and also the expert level. And finally, the actors in the cyber arms race are states alongside non-state actors, also known as NSAs, which have a major role. There are two possible solutions for agreements. The first is that only states will sign the treaty, but each of them will have the responsibility for the action of the NSAs in its territory. And the second is that the initial treaty will be signed only by state actors, because such conventions are open only to them, but with subsequent agreements also including NSAs, such as major private companies or corporations. And this type of treaty can only be implemented once the level of cooperation between countries increases. There are a few ways this can occur. First, despite the differences in attitudes between countries, the rise in tension and the escalation in cyberspace may naturally expand common interests and lead to increased cooperation between the actors. Second, the academia arena can be used as an accelerator for increasing cyber collaboration and to establish an international legal infrastructure to reduce tensions. Some measures have actually already begun, such as with the Italian minimal. And finally, Track 2 negotiation can also be used to reduce tensions. Using NSAs may help to mediate opposing views in a way that enables better understanding and compromise. As history shows, these mechanisms may enable the parties to find common ground and come closer to establish agreements and treaties. Final notes. So while it is true that the challenges of developing legal rules in cyberspace are greater than in the nuclear field, we must nevertheless not give up on our efforts to advance an international cyber treaty. Even if not all the players work together immediately, it is still possible to move forward. An international treaty in cyberspace is only the first step of slowing and preventing the arms race. As demonstrated in the signing of the NPT, the creation of one treaty can serve as a precedent to the signing of many further agreements that will potentially reduce or mitigate the cyber arms race. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that presentation. That was such a great start to the workshop. We'll move on to Lyndon's presentation and then have questions after that. So Dr. Lyndon Burford is a visiting research associate at the Centre for Science and Security Studies at King's College London, where he studies the theory, politics, and practice of nuclear deterrence, arms control, and disarmament. Dr. Burford's talk will discuss his recent paper titled The Trust Machine, Blockchain in Nuclear Disarmament and Arms Control Verification. So Lyndon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Niamh. I hope you guys all got my my screen up there. Cool. So greetings all. Thanks to Niamh and Andrew and the whole team at Student Young Pugwash UK for setting this up. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a research paper, well, my talk's going to be based on a research paper I published late last year on the potential role of blockchain in nuclear disarmament and arms control verification. So today I'm going to go through 3 sections in this presentation. I'll start with an introduction to the context of nuclear disarmament and what the specific policy problem is that I'm trying to address with this paper. Second, I'll talk a little bit about blockchain in terms of what it is, what it does, and why I think it matters. And then third, I'll go on to some of the specific examples from the paper about potential uses for blockchain in this context, but also make a couple of comments more broadly about some of the broader implications of blockchain for international/global security. So turning to this first question of the context and the policy problem. So when we talk about nuclear disarmament, my starting point is that all states, and indeed all humans, share an interest in advancing nuclear disarmament, and states also share responsibilities for nuclear disarmament. So for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty places responsibility for all on all parties to that treaty to advance nuclear disarmament. And equally, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or BAN treaty, that entered into force earlier this year is an expression of the non-nuclear weapon states so far taking responsibility for nuclear disarmament as they are also required to under international law. So the context is that despite these shared interests and responsibilities, it's been extremely difficult to actually make meaningful progress on multilateral nuclear disarmament. And I think the case we saw yesterday of the UK government coming out and announcing that it's planning to increase its maximum potential arsenal size of nuclear warheads is another example of we're heading in the wrong direction. We're heading back towards a nuclear arms race, not towards disarmament. So setting that aside for now, another piece of context here is basically that in this context of nuclear weapons, we often hear a lot of kind of fearful stories about the dangers of new technology and how it may increase nuclear risk. And so what I was doing with this paper is really looking to ask the question, well, are there any good news stories? Is there anywhere we can look at emerging or maturing technologies and say, yeah, here's somewhere we could actually reduce nuclear risks, including through cooperative disarmament action? And in the paper, spoiler, yeah, I answered that. I argued that yes, the answer is yes, and blockchain is one such opportunity. So in terms of the specific policy problem that I'm looking to address, in a nuclear disarmament context where you seek to have a verified drawdown of nuclear weapons, the question is, how can you maximize confidence in that verification system? And so in order to do that, there are certain conditions. And so I lay out, I would say this is not an exhaustive list, but if you want to apply technology to any verification process, first of all, it has to be very high security. Secondly, it has to offer data permanence. And by that, I mean that parties involved will be confident that their data is not going to be hacked. It's not going to be manipulated or changed subsequently, so that it can then become the basis for ongoing dialogue, communication, etc., to further implement the treaty. And third, it needs to have what I call in this report tailored transparency. And that is to say, not all parties to a treaty, or perhaps not all verifying parties, will need to have access to the most sensitive data. In fact, there'll be a lot of data in a disarmament process that's highly proliferation sensitive, and therefore third parties, such as non-nuclear weapon states, should not have access to it. And so technology that's going to contribute to a verification process has to respect at least all of these things. So in the paper, I argue that blockchain has the potential to do these things, and in particular that it can increase the efficiency of disarmament verification processes, but also the effectiveness of those verification processes in terms of increasing confidence in the overall disarmament process. And I argue that it does that whilst also meeting these 3 conditions that I've laid out of high security, data permanence, and tailored transparency. So I argue that this creates the potential to bring non-nuclear armed states into the process of helping to verify disarmament agreements, specifically because of that flexibility about levels of transparency. So leaving that for now, I'll move on to the second part of my talk, which is about what blockchain is and why I think it matters. So my general experience on this has been that a lot of people are still coming to terms with actually the technical details of how blockchain works. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just running through some of that now. So what is blockchain? Well, at base, blockchain is just a data management tool, but it's a very particular kind of data management tool. It's highly secure due to the types of cryptography used. And it's also consensus-based. So the entire network that helps to build and maintain the blockchain is actually also responsible for consensus about the data which is placed on that blockchain. So a blockchain creates a permanent and encrypted record of events. It does this by creating a shared data ledger, a shared record of events, which is what is known as the blockchain. And it does that in a distributed manner so that every computing node on the network both contributes to processing data, verifying that data, and also storing that data. Now, the result of all of those processes being distributed across the network is that you significantly reduce points of failure. So there are no single points of failure on a distributed network. Of course, this is all dependent on precisely how you design the network, and some blockchains are more decentralized than others. But basically, blockchain, by having that distributed nature in terms of data verification and storage, it basically puts in place security by design. So if you contrast to a legacy style system where you have a centralized storehouse of data, what that centralized store of data does is it creates an attack vector. It creates a place where anyone looking to attack is obviously going to target. And that means that you then have to wrap that central storehouse in multiple additional layers of extra security. And each layer of extra security that you wrap around it is another potential vulnerability in the code. And so blockchain gets around those things by distributing responsibility and building in security by design. This results in a storage system that experts refer to as practically immutable, or what you might say practically hackable, practically unhackable, which is to say it is actually technically feasible to hack a blockchain, but it would take an enormous amount of computing power and money. And if you did, the rest of the network would very likely instantly know that you have done it. So you have to have a very specific set of incentives to actually do that when everyone's going to know that you've done it. And finally, it does all of these things without requiring trust between the parties. So the trust is delegated to the blockchain itself, as opposed to requiring trust between the parties that interact on the blockchain. And that trust is possible precisely because the code that's running on the blockchain is auditable by all members of the network. So they can see exactly what the code is doing and when and who's interacting with it. In technical terms, blockchain is actually a combination of several older technologies that are relatively mature. So the first of those is peer-to-peer networking. Again, as I said, the distribution of processing and storage of data on the network. Public key cryptography, or PKI cryptography, which is basically the use of cryptographic pairs of cryptographic keys. So each actor on the network is given a public and a private key, and using that public and private key, that actor can sign digital transactions to generate proof of authenticity of data, and also gain access to the parts of the system that they need to, and verify what other people are doing. And then third, it uses a process called data hashing. And this is really what sets blockchain apart from other forms of distributed ledgers and digital storage systems. This is what gives it that practically immutable or practically unhackable nature. So I'm just going to say a few more words about data hashing, specifically because it is what enables the unique attributes of blockchain. So what is a data hash? So if you look here at the bottom of the screen, you see there's a 64-character string of digits, and that is a hash. A hash used in a blockchain will generally always be that length. So if you look above and you see I've written the phrase new technologies for disarmament. So if I run that phrase through a hashing algorithm, it spits out this hash at the bottom. Now, the hashing algorithm is extremely sensitive. So if you change even a single bit of data in it, for example, if you change a single 0 to a 1, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a full stop to the word disarmament. So if you watch what happens to the hash here, when I add that full stop, you'll see that the hash completely changes. And so that means that the hashing algorithm becomes an identifier that can tell you if the information that you're running through it is exactly the same as the information that you've previously run through it. So it's a way of verifying that no data has changed. Hashing has several advantages, like you could run an entire novel through this and it would still spit out a 64-character hash. And that means that in terms of processing power and storage power required to function with these hashes, it's greatly reduced, so efficiencies are greatly increased. Another critical aspect of a hash is that it's not reverse engineerable. So you can't take the hash and reverse engineer the data that produced the hash. It's exceedingly difficult. And so the way a blockchain is built is that the data that's actually on the blockchain is generally these hashes. It's not the raw data. And so if you're looking at a blockchain, all you can see is a bunch of gibberish, just a bunch of scrambled numbers and letters that mean nothing. And these hashes are used in an interlocking manner so that each new block of data, the hash of that block is partly dependent on the hash of the previous block. So if you change any of them, you get a cascading effect of changes that tells the entire network that a piece of data has been changed. So I'll come back to this in Q&A if anyone's interested, but right now I'll move on to just some of the use cases. So in this paper, the trust machine, I argue that blockchain could be used in disarmament verification to engage non-nuclear armed states. The way that might work, for example, is that the nuclear armed states engaged in a verified disarmament process would they would encrypt the data that they were producing via on-site inspections or remote monitoring sensors, etc. They would then hash that data and place it on a blockchain. If you include non-nuclear armed states as a node on that blockchain network, then non-nuclear armed states take on a role as third-party authenticators to verify the ongoing authenticity of the data on the blockchain. So they're there to make sure that no one is cheating the process once the data goes onto the blockchain. So that gives them a third-party verification role, and it enables them both to pursue their interest in seeing that disarmament agreements are pursued in good faith, and also to fulfill their responsibilities towards nuclear disarmament under the Ban Treaty and the NPT. It's really important to note that using a blockchain does not get out of the need to have on-site inspections and interpersonal human relations with other people involved in the disarmament process. Blockchain is only a data management tool. It's an extremely secure and useful data management tool, but it doesn't get rid of the need for those other human elements of the process. So this is about adding to those in a way that's going to manage data in a more efficient and effective way than existing methods, but it's really a contribution to that existing sort of set of protocols that are being developed in other areas like the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, or the Quad. So the second thing I talk about in this paper is the potential for a private Internet of Things of remote sensors, automatically adding data to a blockchain. So an example of this might be location sensors. So for example, you would take delivery vehicles that are stored at a military base and tag them all with the individual location sensors. Those sensors would then regularly send data back to the blockchain to log precisely where they are. And the blockchain would be encoded to allow a certain degree of movement of those location sensors. As soon as those location sensors move outside of the pre-agreed boundaries, for example, a pre-agreed military base, it would immediately send a message to the entire network. And so every node on the blockchain could see that there'd been a potential breach of the treaty because that delivery vehicle had moved outside of the pre-agreed bounds. And as a result, that would enable inspectors to really target their activities to where they're going to be most useful for verifying compliance, non-compliance issues. So again, adding to that greater efficiency of the system by targeting the activities of the inspectors. So I've only got 30 seconds left, so I'm just going to zoom out and say beyond these cases, there are other cases in the paper. I recommend you check it out if you're interested. But more generally, this type of technology could be helped, for example, to prevent future hacks of the SolarWinds type, precisely because every time you're using data, you can run it through a hash and store it on a blockchain. And then when you come back to that same data, you can do the same thing, run it back through the same hashing algorithm, and you'll know if a single byte of data has been changed since you last looked at it. So now that's not going to completely solve all of the problems of supply chain monitoring, etc., but it's an added and very powerful level or layer of security that can be used. Equally, it could be used to build Internet of Things without corporate gatekeepers or data monopolies that sit in the middle and create vulnerabilities. And then the one final thought that I'd leave you with is that data permanence is all well and good, but what does data permanence mean when we take it in the context of the right to be forgotten? So that's an ongoing ethical challenge that international blockchains still need to address. So thanks very much for your attention, and look forward to any questions.
Great, thank you, Lyndon. So we have now 10 to 15 minutes for discussion and questions on the first two papers before going on to Natalia's presentation, which is the final one of today. I think I'll get the Q&A and discussion section kicked off, and I have a question for each speaker. As Andrew has said in the chat, if you do have any questions, you can either place them directly in the chat or place them in the chat and then also indicate that you're happy to verbalize them yourself. So please do add any questions or points of discussion that you want to raise while I ask these initial two questions. So my question for Shira is, it was really great hearing your presentation. One thing that I was thinking about is within conversations around the security of cyberspace at the moment, there is kind of a dominant approach that is looking at developing norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And this is really what international diplomatic efforts have been focused on, is agreeing upon certain norms that states and sometimes non-state actors should adhere to in their behavior. And I was wondering what you thought the advantages were of a treaty-based approach over the kind of pre-existing dominant approach, which has been on agreeing norms. And then if you thought that there was any relationship between the two and how agreeing norms might then later contribute to a treaty. And then my question for Lyndon was about something that often comes up in conversations around disarmament and non-proliferation, which is the question of trust. I think it seems like there's some really interesting applications that can be made by introducing blockchain into nuclear disarmament verification structures. But one thing I wonder about is not necessarily the trust between parties, but almost the trust in technology. And when you're introducing digital technologies that say political leaders or even experts, but experts in non-digital technologies, how do you encourage these communities and develop trust in the technology itself amongst the people who will be making kind of the political determinations around things like nuclear disarmament verification?
Okay, should I start? Just to make sure that I understand your question well, because I'm not sure. Do you mean that with the non-state actors, if the norms will be established, how they will implement them, and will, just to make sure?
More about, what would you think the advantages of a treaty-based approach to cyberspace is over negotiating norms that might not necessarily be legal?
Okay, this is a very good question. I didn't thought about it first, but I think just on a first thought that a treaty, as we can saw in the nuclear space, is something more established, like in a paper that you can then build on. Then you can build other agreements on. And if there are just like general norms in the field, it's not very established as a treaty. So I think to put things like on the table is the most important thing to do first. Norms, I guess, maybe there is the, I think 2001 Budapest agreement treaty, but it's like it's very narrow norms, and I think like a more extensive one and more full one kind of a treaty can be more effective than just general norms.
Great, thank you.
Cool. I'll jump in then. Thanks very much for the question, Niamh. Yeah, so trust in technology. So a few things. I think we're at the very earliest stage of widespread adoption and acceptance of blockchain, and so there is still a lot of suspicion of it. There is a very common narrative that it's just for criminals or terrorists, and in actual fact, the data suggests otherwise. The data, there's a company that tracks this worldwide, and actually the amount of illicit activity that's been transacted using cryptocurrencies has actually been reducing in recent years, down to a level of, I think the figure was about 0.38% in the last study. So 0.38% of global cryptocurrency exchanges were illicit activity as of 2020. So, sorry, I think it was the 2020 report. So it's a minuscule amount, but it's certainly top of mind when policymakers hear about that. So I think it's about educating. In terms of how do you get people to trust this type of technology for something so sensitive, I think it's worth pointing out. Again, I think it's a little bit of an education game, right? For example, I'd point out that Visa, MasterCard, PayPal are all actively developing blockchain-based solutions to international financial transacting. Blockchain is already being used to track, well, actually, there are existing prototypes that have already been stood up to track nuclear material supply chains in public-private partnerships in Australia, the United States, and Finland. Finland actually has a prototype, full-scale, national-level prototype to track nuclear materials from the beginning of the supply chain right through to disposition of nuclear waste. And governments all around the world, I mean, dozens of governments around the world being led predominantly by China with its DCEP project, are developing what they call central bank digital currencies, which are actually not a digital representation of cash, but actually a digital first, fully programmable store of money. CBDC, a central bank digital currency. So that's being developed all around the world. What doesn't appear to have happened is that crossover doesn't appear to have made it from the more financial trade industry side of the world across into international security. But the reason that it's being applied in all of those contexts is because of all of the things I said about data certainty, reducing single points of failure, data permanence, and the variable transparency that it allows you. So yeah, to me, I think it's kind of a natural evolution for where we're going, but I think there's still somewhere to go in terms of educating policymakers as to the potential that it offers.
Great, thank you. So we have a question to Shira from Nasir in the chat. Nasir, do you want to comment audio, or are you happy for me to read it out? I'll just give them a moment. Okay, I'll go ahead and read it out. So how can objective laws be set under an international regime when cyber tech is evolving on an everyday basis?
Okay, so that's a very good question, and the difficulty that you have raised is the same difficulty that I also raised in my presentation, that the speed and the rapid development of the domain making some difficulties to form this kind of treaty. And I think that maybe those rules, those objective rules, should be kind of flexible rules that kind of are constantly being reviewed. And maybe those, as I said, that maybe at first not all countries will join and it will be a process. So maybe every period of time, those rules should be up to vote again, and just to check if they are still relevant and still objective to all the members that join the treaty. So maybe just more a flexible form of rule will make them more objective over time. So this is one solution that I can think of.
Thank you. If there's no more questions, we might move on to Natalia's presentation. Let me just see if anyone comes in on the chat, but then there will be time at the end to have a conversation and ask any questions about all the presentations. I think all of these presentations are quite thematically linked, as I said, so I'm sure things will come up as we hear from our final presenter. Cool. So it doesn't seem like anyone else has a question so far about the first two presentations. So I will introduce our third speaker for today. So there we go. So Natalya Samoylovskaya is a research fellow at Moscow State Institute of International Relations and the chair of the Russian student Young Pugwash group. She has recently published on the economic impacts of artificial intelligence and has published through British Pugwash a paper on emerging technologies and nuclear security. So Natalia's talk is on opportunities and challenges for EU and Russian cooperation in AI research and development. So over to you.
Thank you, Niamh. Thank you, dear colleagues. I'm really happy to be part of such interesting discussion. And my talk will be with slides, but I think that I hope it will be interesting for you. The rapid development of dual-use technologies alongside the lack of progress in the traditional arms control architecture feed uncertainty in international relations. The worst-case scenario in this context is an uncontrolled arms race and the polarization of the world in the face of rising distrust. To avoid this situation, international society is searching for responsible approaches to the use of military AI in all cycles, from research to deployment. The AI principles developed by the EU in its human-centric approach, which run parallel with national initiatives of several member states on ethics and AI, are particularly interesting here. As pointed out in the European Union's guidelines on ethics in artificial intelligence, this approach will unfold in the context of the global race on AI. In this context, effective cooperation on sensitive issues such as the military use of AI may become an optional platform for developing integration among like-minded states. However, there are risks of it being polarized if the decision is made to follow only national standards or standards developed by a separate regional group of countries. This is why one of the key challenges here is misperception and misunderstanding. In the SYP report, Responsible Military Use of Artificial Intelligence, Can the European Union Lead the Way in Developing Best Practice? The authors point out that the EU members would benefit from the responsible military use of AI, but there is a huge risk that the military policies of the United States, China, and Russia could affect EU values in this field. Despite the fact that Russia occupies a weak position in AI R&D in the world rankings, Russia is a leader in terms of the military application of AI. This is why it is in Europe's interest to involve Russia in the development of a common platform and standards for AI. The development and establishment of common safety standards will help avoid problems with perception and introduce an element of predictability in relations. Taking the current crisis between the EU and Russia into account, I would like to answer the question of whether it is possible for the EU and Russia to work collaboratively toward the development of common principles on trustworthy AI. And I would like to cite Russian Pugwash member, head of the Department of European Political Studies at the Primakov National Research Institute of Russian Academy of Sciences. Nadezhda Arbatova pointed out in her recent interview that despite all the optimism about the impossibility of a complete break in Russia's relations with the European Union, it should be recognized that a reset of these relations in today's circumstances is not possible. The maximum that can be hoped for is selective interaction in a very narrow corridor of opportunities. And I think that OSCE is one of these opportunities. OSCE is one of these opportunities, especially in AI field. The OECD Artificial Intelligence Policy Observatory may hold potential in this respect for the European Union and Russia. Of course, transparent military cooperation between the EU and Russia is unlikely. However, launching cooperation in different public policy areas may lead to progress in the development of trustworthy AI standards between the two sides. The International Organization for Standardization, ISO, is a good example for such cooperation. The most ethical EU principles of AI are harmonized with the OECD principles on AI adopted in May 2019, and based on the understanding of trustworthy AI, which includes security and safety standards required for military use. And the authors of the SYP report note an important aspect here. The safety of AI is a key for the military use of these technologies, and high technical standards could provide the legal and ethical norms for the military sector. According to a group of researchers from SYP and IISS, strategy and ethics may be reconciled not only by sharing best practices and safety standards, but also through track 1.5 diplomacy and track 2 diplomacy and the multi-stakeholder activity. This reflects the links between science, industry, and the military sector and allows for great flexibility and creativity, even in sensitive security matters. UNESCO's educational initiative under the Beijing Consensus on Artificial Intelligence and Education had the most integrative potential in this respect. Active participation of EU members and Russia in UNESCO's approach to AI may become an additional platform for setting common normative and ethical principle for AI in the early educational stage. Such Russia has a unique national coordinating body for the development of the UNITWIN UNESCO chair program in Russia with 66 departments in university participating. Universities in this context may become first providers for sharing educational practices of trustworthy AI. This year, in February, the first Russian-French Forum on Artificial Intelligence was held in a video conference format in frames of the Trianon Dialogue. Coordinator of the Trianon Dialogue, Vice Rector of Niamh University, noted that the Trianon Dialogue is aimed at finding new points of contact between civil societies and professional communities of our countries. Artificial intelligence technologies are one of the most priority and promising research areas for both Russia and France. The Trianon Dialogue is ready to actively support bilateral initiatives in this area. Scientific Council of the Russian Academy of Sciences on the methodology of artificial intelligence and cognitive research has a huge network of scientists in this field and traditionally open for scientific cooperation. Such the first US-USSR working groups on nuclear issues during the Cold War started thanks to academician context and then were transformed in frames of Pugwash movement that in Russia has close ties with the Academy of Science. This experience tells us that compromise always is possible and depends on the wish to start the long but inevitable process of bringing positions closer together. Trends in AI development show that this technology has a fundamental impact on human society, while the complexity of AI and the interconnection between its civil and military application create difficulties when it comes to finding a single solution for the international community. But this also opens up opportunities for a common approach. And an analysis of national strategies and initiatives show that states are aware of the risk and challenges and want to engage in dialogue in this field. But geopolitical competition and distrust impose certain restriction on this process. The responsible use of AI involves, first of all, developing constructive collaboration to mitigate the challenges stemming from the military use of AI, which is for the most part based on strategic calculation rather than on ethical standards. This is why the international community needs inclusiveness and harmonization despite the geopolitical competition and distrust. And in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that there are many different dimensions for cooperation between the EU and Russia in the AI field despite the political background. The proactive approach in this field is essential to form an understandable language for the basis of confidence measures building. The EU and its member states would benefit strategically from sharing and developing with Russia principles and standards for trustworthy AI. It may become a substantial basis for engaging in conversation on the responsible military use of AI and arms control in common. There are multiple ways for the EU and its member states to carry out expert dialogue and discuss responsible military use of AI in general. And the CPRI recommendation for EU in the mentioned report above on the responsible military use of AI are complementary for EU-Russian discussion with engagement in dialogue, academia, industry, and broader society, the business sector, and civil society on issues related to the development, use, and control of military AI by focusing on different areas, including legal compliance, ethical acceptability, and safety. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. We have two questions from Nazir, who would like to come onto audio to ask them. So let me unmute Nazir.
Good morning, everyone. Though it is night here in Pakistan, and my first question is to Shira that we have seen that the private enterprises share a large portion of stakes in the development of cyber technology. So, could there be any possibility that the regime or any international treaty should be formed which specifically focuses on the private enterprises and restrict them, confines them to the moral obligations, as you already have said that objective laws cannot actually confine them to oblige. So, can there be any treaty which confine the private enterprises to develop the technology, to develop the cyber technology in more humanistic manner rather than in a disruptive manner?
Thank you for the question. So I think there may be two solutions for that. The first one is if the states signing, of course, only state can sign a treaty. That's true, but they can be responsible inside the treaty. They can be responsible for the companies and private corporation that they are in their territory, and therefore they will be responsible for all the ethical issues and to promote more ethical technology that those corporations and companies will develop. And also the other solution for that, I think that a first treaty will be signed by states, but other like kind of smaller agreements or agreements that continue and based on the first treaty can be also signed by corporation, big corporation and private ones, and then they can guarantee in those following agreements the ethical issues and develop technology that helps everyone. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you so much. Should I ask the other question as well?
Yes, go ahead, Nazir. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So the other question is to Natalia, that it is related to the AI. Throughout my literature, which I have gone through, the military use of AI, it is mostly emphasized on the traditional or offensive approach in order to enhance the traditional capabilities of a state. But there has been a little focus on the non-traditional aspect of AI. For example, our nuclear arsenals or our strategic assets, any country whoever has those assets, they face non-traditional threats. We have seen Chernobyl, we have seen Fukushima Daiichi. So I'm not going to ask that how AI can be used to maximize our protection of the strategic assets, but I'm gonna ask that how we can emphasize being an academic, or how we can emphasize the international community to focus more on uh, safeguarding the strategic assets through AI rather than using AI for traditional military or offensive approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nasser, for your question. It's a very complex question because AI technology and nuclear field are very wide, and this implementation this technology have different aspects. And shortly, I would like to emphasize about opportunities. Yes, I think that implementation of AI in nuclear field also has opportunities. And in the last SYP research and at the last conference by Germany Ministry of Foreign Affairs showed that these opportunities could be applied in the field of command and control in nuclear sphere, and in context of verification and in other specific fields. And I think that in this respect, the community should have possibility to act and to use IE technology in positive way and in negative way. The positive way is to make our confidence building measure more stronger, and negative way is, as I mentioned in my report, to go into uncontrolled arms race. And I think that we have now on international level two trends. First of all, and activity of STEM community, because these specialists are aware of challenges, and they make steps to protect from these challenges. And the second trend is, of course, implementation of IE technologies in military sphere. And I think that these two trends have connections, and I think that it's possible to work in this way on the level of activities as STEM community and the level of activities of states. But there is a very important point: states should want to aware this superiority in IE military sphere. It is very difficult, but I think it's possible.
Great, thank you. We have another question for you, Natalia, from Lyndon, who's asked, in practical terms, do you have any examples of what the first steps towards interaction should be and who should take them? And I actually have a question relating to that as well. When I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about kind of track 2 negotiations, and what role do you think track 2 meetings or track 1.5 meetings with companies involved in the commercial development of AI, what role that might play in what you propose?
Thank you, Niamh, for your question. I think that track 2 and track 1.5 diplomacy are very important for IE field, because states, as we see now at the GGE platform, the debates are, in my opinion, on laws are endless. Because the position of states now is national interests, and from this position, I don't think that we will find solution very easy. And that's why I think that we should have discussion in a more wider context with industry, with representatives from educational sphere, with civil society. And I think that because in this field people are people don't have limitation only in political or in national interest context. We may find more flexible and flexible approach and solution to the problem of AI.
Excellent. And it just responding to what Lyndon placed in the chat, what would you imagine kind of the first steps would be?
I think I should, of course, it should be on the level of states communication, and I think it should be mutual steps. And I had example in my presentation, Trianon dialogue between France and Russia, and it's really has results, and it's really has potential, in my opinion, and it includes really wide participants in this dialogue. Wide range of participants. Thank you.
Great. It's really interesting to hear your presentation, Natalia, after hearing Shira's. Like, I can see so many parallels between trying to develop international governance for cyberspace and then trying to develop international governance for AI. Even trying to separate those two concepts out is challenging because of obviously like the massive intersections. And then Lyndon, when you were presenting as well and talking about the private Internet of Things for disarmament verification, I was thinking in my head, I'm like, oh, the cybersecurity implications of that is an ongoing challenge. Yeah, so I would encourage anyone who has any remaining questions to put them into the chat. I think from me, one thing that I've taken away from the conversations today is it is very interesting and exciting how in all these different areas of emerging technologies, there is new approaches being taken towards both kind of political arrangements and thinking about new treaties we might negotiate or new ways we might build mutual understanding between states as to future governance of technologies. And then at the same time, you see how emerging technologies can help us with addressing long-standing issues such as the verification of nuclear disarmament. So you have these two areas of great activity, which is really interesting to hear about. Great. Okay, so I'm going to give a final shout out to any more questions if people would like to ask them. I'll have a think of things that I was thinking about as well. I guess one thing that applies to both Natalia and Shira's presentation is what kind of challenges do you think there is or are in bringing non-state actors like companies into the kind of the domain of international diplomacy and negotiating treaties?
Shira?
It's okay, you can start.
Thank you. I think that we have example on international level now at GG platform. There are a wide range of discussion with NGOs and non-states organization, non-governmental organization. for example, the campaign of Stop Killer Robots campaign and the Red Cross. And I think that this is very vivid example because this organization has another position, and thank them. Now I think that the more traditional position of states may have opposition, and this because this discussion will have more effect on decision making. Thank you.
I will just add to Natalia. There was during this year the Athena's Democracy Forum 2020. I don't know if you heard about that, but there are some. There were some panels there that they were specifically talked with representatives from Facebook and Google, on all the big companies, and they tackle them kind of with questions: how can they be part of agreements and treaty, and how to deal with the developing with the emerging technologies that all those companies are implement and use. And so I think there is no one answer now, but I think the good news that it's on discussion right now, and the big companies are talking about that, and they are trying to find solutions, as you can see in this big committee. So I think maybe this is the good news. We don't have also in the committee the final notes that there is no full answer for that now, but I think they are all kind of try to find the right mechanisms that they are not going to hurt as private companies, but also can collaborate with the government that obviously will put sanctions of them one day if they are not collaborate in an efficient way. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that nicely leads into a question that Richard has put into the chat. So Richard, would you like to ask live, or are you happy for me to read?
I can read it out, because I realize I typed it very quickly and I haven't typed it as elegantly as I might have done. But it's really to all the speakers. It's that the issues of cyber and AI are really key around the questions of standard setting, but a lot of this discussion has been only within expert communities, and yet these are things that bring tremendous benefits if they're done right. They also bring costs, even if it's just financial costs of setting the things up and monitoring them. So what steps are needed, or are there steps we can take to help public discussion and public understanding of these issues, so that societies as a whole can help being part of this debate to work out what is the acceptable standards, what are the acceptable sort of costs and benefits?
I can start, maybe. Thank you for your question. I think it's a very important one. I was for a few months part of the National Cyber Directorate in Israel, so I can give the perspective from there. I was an intern there, and I saw how this body that was established just kind of less than a decade ago try to give the public to collaborate with the public. They use social media and try to collaborate with them and try to ask them what do the public think, and kind of try to in their policies to implement the public opinion, because many people here in Israel are in the high tech arena. So really, I think that the public opinion is really matter to the Cyber Directorate. They try to implement and then reflect again the policies that they made.
Thank you a lot for the question. I think that it may be open access to result of such discussions, and I think maybe more scientific publications in this field. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Richard. I guess from my perspective, in the context of blockchain specifically as a cyber technology of sorts, I think I would just encourage everybody to pick a few publications and actually dig into them, because what I so often get is that when you start talking about blockchain, that immediately just leads into this leap to cryptocurrencies, which leads into a leap to it's all terrorists and criminals. And as I said, like, that's such a misnomer. It's certainly true that there is criminal activity and illicit trade going on through blockchain, yes. But look, the mainstream banks launder trillions of dollars a year in US dollar denominated, illicit trade, trillions. So, what's happening in the blockchain space is a different form of that, but it's a drop in the bucket. And I think that's often blown out of proportion. And if you step back from those particular challenges, not that we should ignore them. I'm not saying that we should ignore the illicit sides of cryptocurrency trade. We should be tracking that. But if you step back from a broader perspective, there is just an incredible number of potential applications of blockchain to all areas of manufacturing, trade, medicine, security, like all manner of different things where it offers opportunities to do what we're already doing so much better and with so much greater security, that it really, I think, would serve if the public looked past those attention-grabbing headlines and actually dug a little deeper into what is this and what does it make possible. I guess that would be my plea as someone that's interested in this space.
I'm assuming your nod was because you were muted when you know. Just to follow up, actually, particularly to Lyndon there, I mean, part of what I was trying to tease out, and I realize I might not have been as clear as I might have been, is also these things all come with a cost. So I can see all of these things you talk about blockchains being an advantage. But there's been a lot of media comment. I have no expertise in it other than to repeat the media comment that things like Bitcoin mining is incredibly energy intensive. So, setting a standard, introducing a tool has costs and it has benefits. When I used to wear a different hat on, I used to have to do sort of introductions to politics. And one of the things I always used to say is that the hardest part of politics is where a different group of people is paying the costs of something to those who are benefiting from it. If the costs and benefits fall on the same people, you just talk to them and say, how much do you want to pay for how much you're getting? But the problem with some of these things is, like blockchain, is there's a cost to everybody in terms of environmental impact of energy generation to power these things, with perhaps a few people benefiting, but sometimes also the other way around, where a few people can spend a certain amount of effort securing things better, but the whole society benefits. And those people don't necessarily want to spend a lot of money securing things. So it was to sort of tease out how those costs and benefits interact. And so the specific question to you, Lyndon, is, if you introduce all these blockchain things for a larger range of security issues, do you have a huge increase in energy consumption by all the processing time? And what would then be the impact of that perhaps against other techniques that might be used to try and get the same security benefits? Sorry, that's a bit long-winded of a question.
No, it's a good question. It's totally relevant. I don't at all dismiss the need to decarbonize everything that we do. But again, I think that there's a lot of, and I would class it as hype in media reporting, because media wants big flashy headlines. So it's true that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. It's also true that the large majority of that energy is from renewables, and increasingly so. It's also true that a significant portion of that energy is actually using what's known sometimes as trapped energy, which is the energy that's generated at source and then flared off, for example. So what people have started doing is building Bitcoin mining rigs at the source in order to capture that energy, which otherwise is just being wasted. In the broader context of how does that relate to other forms of blockchains and this idea that we could expand their use, Bitcoin is unique. It's not unique, but it's particular in the type of algorithm that it uses for developing consensus among the network, which is called a proof of work algorithm. And that proof of work algorithm, as it suggests, requires a lot of computing work. Other blockchains use different consensus algorithms. So there's another one that's being developed by the second most well-developed blockchain, which is Ethereum, which is actually proof of stake, which is just a fundamentally different algorithm in terms of the way that the network develops consensus amongst its members, and which uses a fraction of the electricity cost. So the proof of work algorithm as it's currently being used by Bitcoin is a problem, yes. That problem is actively being addressed from within the community, because remember, a lot of people in this community are actually Gen Z or millennials who care about these things. So it's actively being addressed through the development of greater renewable use of energy for Bitcoin. But equally, more broadly, it's being addressed through the development of other types of consensus mechanisms that just don't need that type of energy. More broadly, I would zoom back even further and say all technology is political. So no technology is neutral, no technology is just a tool. All technology is inherently imbued with political decisions, which are imbued with ethical decisions. And so the choice to apply energy, in this case, the use of electricity, to a particular technology is a value judgment. It is imbued with value judgment. So what I would say is the current system that we have, which is the legacy system of burning fossil fuels and opaque banking, global banking systems that have gatekeepers that just extract wealth, is riddled with externalities. It's riddled with economic and environmental and injustice externalities. And what blockchain enables is a fundamentally different way of doing that, where there's transparency because everyone on the network can see exactly what's going on. There's distribution of power because everyone on the network is responsible both for generating, monitoring, and storing data. And so there's the opportunity to empower an incredible opportunity to empower communities that were not previously empowered through the use of this. For example, generating remote microelectricity grids. That type of stuff is just not possible with the current setup for a number of reasons. There are other technologies involved, battery technologies, et cetera, but that technology is really coming along. But to have micro generation at source that is equitably distributed across the community, generated by the community, and then equitably distributed across the community, blockchain makes that possible in ways that legacy systems don't. And so there's incredible opportunities there to develop entirely new ways of doing things that lose all of the externalities of the wasted electricity, because we've got a centralized national grid. So you have to centralize all the power in the first place, where you lose power getting it to the central storage site. And then you have to decentralize it all to send it back out to the users, and you further lose electricity. So all of these types of things can be addressed through technological developments like blockchain more broadly. And so while I don't deny the concern about Bitcoin, it's a value judgment, and it's often used to deflect from the fact that there are those industries that are making all of those big headline, oh, it's terrible, are doing it because their interests are being challenged by a more decentralized and a more just way of doing things that doesn't actually serve their financial interests. That was a bit of a long answer, sorry, but there you go. Like, I get this a lot, and having the chance to just like is welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndon. I think that's a really great note to end on. I really agree to what you were saying about how tech is not neutral, and that the way we design it and the way we develop it often can lead it to having biases. And I think this is something we should all bear in mind and think about when working on emerging technologies. So I think that's a great point at which to end today. Thank you so much to our three speakers. Your presentations were so interesting, and I feel like there was some really good conversation there about the connections between these different issues that you were writing and speaking about. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thank you also to our audience for giving up time to come and join us on your Wednesday evening. And also a big shout out to Andrew Gibson for organizing this series of workshops. It's so much work, and this and the workshop we've had so far, as well as the workshop that other workshops we're going to be having next week, are just great opportunities to continue Pugwash's ethos, even though it is remote at the moment. So I hope everyone can join me in saying a thank you to Andrew. Yeah, so have a great rest of the evening, everyone, and enjoy your Wednesday. And Andrew has just put in the chat there the link to our remaining events, so please do check them out. They look fascinating, and we have another couple of batches of excellent speakers to enjoy the work of. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Niamh. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shira and Natalia.
Thank you.